I'm up on my feet. I'm firing at him. He's firing at me. And we're like feet apart. And I'm getting hit. I'm getting hit in the upper chest. I could feel it. Initially, the bullets were burning, but it wasn't like they hurt. It was the acrid, pungent smell of, I guess, gunpowder, like you're at the range. At that moment, the bullets hit my femur, my upper leg. That was when I felt excruciating pain.
Welcome to episode 375 of FBI Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. This episode is a replay of my original conversation with retired agent John Kuchta back in July of 2022. I'm posting it again because on November 13th, 2025, John will be honored as this year's FBI Agents Association's G-Man Honors Salute to FBI Heroes honoree. Congratulations to John. This annual event benefits the FBI Agents Association's Memorial College Fund and the FBI AA Membership Assistance Fund. To donate, there's a link in the show notes and in your podcast app's description of this episode. Today, we get to speak to retired agent John Kuchta, who served in the FBI for 27 years. In this episode, he reviews the 1994 ambush at the D.C. Metro Police Headquarters, where a gunman killed Special Agents Martha Dixon and Michael Miller and D.C. Metropolitan Police Sergeant Henry Hank Daly. During this shooting, John survived multiple gunshot wounds to his heart, liver, kidney, lung, arm, and leg. For his actions on that tragic day on November 22nd, 1994, he was awarded the FBI Medal of Valor and the U.S. Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Heroism in recognition of his actions involving the voluntary risk of personal safety and life performed in the line of duty in the face of a criminal encounter. He was also awarded the FBI Star in recognition of serious injury and split-second decision made under fire. During John Kuchta's career, he investigated violent crimes, drugs, gangs, crimes against children, white-collar crime, corruption, and national security matters. While he was recovering from his injuries, he served as a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C. He later was transferred to the Tampa Division with assignments to Regional Command East in Afghanistan and as the Criminal Assistant Legal Attaché, ALAT, in London, England for 4 years. He retired from the FBI as the Senior Supervisory Resident Agent for Southwest Florida and is currently the Chief Security Officer of an aerospace company. We also heard from John during the tribute to Martha Dixon in episode 266. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link where you can join my reader team and visit my website to check out my books and this episode's show notes. Thanks for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, John Kuchta. Hi, John. How are you?
Great, and thanks for having me, Jerry.
Thank you for being here today. I've expressed my concern to you about having you recount this story. I'm really concerned that I'm not making this an emotional moment for you.
I appreciate your genuine concern, but I think it's our duty really to go through this and recount the sacrifices of Martha, Mike, and Hank, our friends on that fateful day. I don't want to leave out Billy Christian. I almost look at this incident as a continuum of a very bad and dark time in our nation's history. Although the shooting that he was involved in was 6 months after, it's really part of that whole time period, which really kind of turned the tide and changed Washington, D.C. to turn it back to the shining city on the hill and what the capital of the free world should be.
One of the things you mentioned to me was that you had gotten advice from Gordon McNeil, who was in the Miami shootout. What did he say to you?
He reached out to me, and I talked to him many times up until he passed years back. He almost became like a phone mentor to me because having been through it, I had long, deep conversations with him. You go through everything from survivor guilt to the failure to sleep at night and just a lot of things. He was quite helpful. Gordy told me years back, don't let this incident define you. I've really tried not to. I mean, it's with you every day. It never leaves. I tried to make my own career in spite of this, reach different personal goals and family goals and things of that nature, and not just be pigeonholed into this incident.
When I was going to reach out to you to ask you to participate initially in the memorial tribute episode I did for Martha Dixon, I was surprised to see when I Googled your name that you have not participated in a lot of public presentations.
Yeah, that's true. I've spoken when asked, like at the law enforcement memorial after this happened. I gave a couple news interviews early on. And when I was over in London, I did presentations to police agencies over there, one being MI5 and a couple of the various police agencies, some local sheriff's departments and things like that. It's more like to train how to survive a critical incident, the mental acumen that you need. Not everybody's the same and everybody's different, but I guess how my personal story of how we got through it, one, the grace of God and a lot of support from my wife and family members, friends, and prayers of a nation. And,
Well, I want to let you know how important it is, not just for me as the host of a podcast, but for everyone listening who is going to be able to learn from you telling this story. I'm honored to have you tell us about what happened that day. Where do you want to start?
To tell this story, we need to set the stage of Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. My friend Paul Timko and I, we graduated from the FBI Academy together. And when we got our orders, we both got Washington, D.C. And we're like, wow, we really must be special. They're sending us to Washington, D.C. We look back at that and we really laugh because Washington, D.C. was the murder capital in the U.S. By 1991, the year we graduated, there's 484 homicides in the city. And I mean, just the level of violent crime. There's like about 150 homicides in DC in 1985, which is still a lot. That's 150 too many. But then the crack epidemic hit in about 1996, and all the gang violence and associated with the crack trade washed ashore and hit Washington, D.C. really hard. And then the murder rate just like doubled in 1 year. And in late 1980s, they're averaging in the 400s as far as homicides. And the homicide stayed in the 400s, and it started to go down as the crime problem got under control. And I believe that's really a direct and proximate result of the work of law enforcement, prosecutors, taking really bad people off the streets and really turned the tide with getting the people behind that. It's not happening now in this country, but I think we can learn a lot of the lessons of history with the efforts of law enforcement to really change this monumental amount of homicides and violent crime that were going on in our country. Really peaked, I think, in the early 1990s, and people said, this is enough. I really, truly believe that the sacrifices Martha, Mike, Hank, Bill, and the other law enforcement officers out there that gave their life in the line of duty was a galvanizing moment in our country to turn the tide and wake up the country and say that we had enough. This was it. This was our last stand, and we're going to fight back at this point. When I showed up my first day on the job at the old Buzzards Point, and it was in a really blighted area of the city, and it's kind of funny. I went back for a conference just a few months ago. I'm in the private sector now, but I went back to the FBI DSAC conference that they have for their private corporation outreach and stuff. And my friend Aaron McGee took us past the old Buzzards Point. Now it's like this spectacular condo complex, and there's like beautiful stores, and it's near National Stadium. But when I got there, it was just such a blighted area. And there was this nightclub next door, which was like frequented by every gangbanger in the city of DC. And on the first day that I showed up at work after graduating from the FBI Academy, there was actually still broken police tape littering the sidewalk because there was a homicide that happened right on the sidewalk outside the Washington field office back then. At night, you'd turn on the lights to go into the restroom, and like roaches were scattering and you could hear like rats running through the ceiling. It was a pretty awful place, but it kind of summed up how the city was back then. And people that weren't there that go to DC now, it really truly is that shining city on a hill, and it's new and it's beautiful. But back then, it was a killing field. In 1994, there was roughly 2,500 assault with a deadly weapon or assault with intent to kill, ADWs or AWICs. But for advances in medical science or the fact that these bad guys couldn't shoot straight, that would have been 2,500 homicides on top of the 484 in 91, on top of the 470 some that happened in 1994 alone. It was the murder capital years running. The numbers would stay constant until law enforcement turned the tide. Unfortunately, I think the peace dividend's probably being squandered right now. But it was not uncommon to go do an interview with parts of the city and the staccato crackle of automatic weapon fire or the hiss of the MPD radio that you carried, which yell out shots fired or officer needs assistance. It was pretty much the sound of the city back then. 1994, more Americans were murdered in Washington, D.C. than the number of U.S. servicemen and women killed in hostile action in the first 8 years of our war in Afghanistan. Think about that.
Unbelievable.
It was bad, okay? We had a mission and we were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, optimistic that we would turn the tide. I look back in D.C. now and there were the sacrifices that we'll talk about today, but I think there has to be an immense level of appreciation from American society for what was done during those days to make it what it is now.
Tell me about your assignment, what your role was in turning the tide on the number of violent crime and murders in DC.
Well, I don't know how big my role was. I was a young agent at the time. I was right out of the academy. I started on a drug squad. Well, I started on the applicant squad in Washington. I got off of that after about 6 months, and I got the C6, the drug squad, and Eddie McLaughlin, a legend from the Stone case and the Pizza Connection case and others. And there it was more like a macro view of we were working. I was part of a team we were sitting on wiretaps on the Rayful Edmond case. And Rayful Edmond was the kingpin who brought crack cocaine to Washington, D.C. He was put in jail, and then he actually ran his drug empire from Lewisburg Federal Prison. The reason actually why we have recorded phone calls now in jails directly came out of that case. That was the macro level, but I was young and I wanted action. Doing enterprise type cases weren't as interesting for me at that time. And I wanted the action. I wanted to be out there in the streets. I wanted to be working with detectives. These task forces were starting back then. I raised my hand, Martha raised her hand, Mike raised his hand at the time, and we got ourselves on this major crime gang task force. It was short-lived, but we were now under Squad 21, C21. We did that until that kind of dissolved, and then we were put into the cold case homicide task force. 3 years in the bureau, it's like, to me, I just hit pay dirt. I hit the lottery because now I was going to be working with DC homicide detectives in the murder capital, and we're going to be solving cold case homicides. The whole point of the cold case squad was to bring federal assistance, aid to the Metropolitan Police Department because homicides were just piling up. Homicide detectives would be responding and opening cases, but never have time to really work them. They didn't have time to solve them because they were on to the next one. And so this was just a way to start clearing the homicide. We each partnered up with a detective. My detective was fortunate to have Detective Lauren Ledman, the late Lauren Ledman, God rest his soul. These guys were master craftsmen. They were artists in the way they conducted interviews. And I was like a sponge. I was just trying to learn as much as I could, not just investigative techniques and things of that nature, but just the art of the interview, the art of how these guys used a read method and they built rapport with like the most hardened, tough people, or how they would get witnesses to talk who'd been threatened and intimidated. And the whole idea behind that cold case squad, everything's a federal crime, pseudo-federal crime in Washington, D.C. It's a federal city, so FBI had jurisdiction to work with them. And it was a great experience for someone like me who didn't have the investigative experience to learn from the best of the best, as well as other agents of varying levels of experience, certainly Mike, certainly Martha, Jerry Bammel, others that were like second office agents who had been in for quite a while. To me, it was where exactly I wanted to be at that time in my life. And the mission was just trying to clean up the city and put bad guys in jail and stop the murders. My day would be pretty much, I would go to the Washington field office in the mornings, get there like mid-morning, because you would work in through the night. Back then, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have Google. We didn't have Google Maps. I don't believe there was even, there might have been one internet connected computer with a dial-up modem back in the field office. Everything was like old school, looking through the old 3x5 card catalogs to do any kind of research, looking through the hard books to find addresses. And the whole concept of that cold case squad was we would investigate what was deemed gang-related homicides of over a year old. And the idea behind going after cases that were over a year old was witnesses were more likely to come forward because maybe there was animosity built up between the shooter. There was less of a chance of retaliation against witnesses. Maybe the shooter was in jail on some unrelated charge at this point, and our job was to solve these crimes. That kind of is in a nutshell of what our purpose was, what our mission was, and where we were going. I would hook up with this veteran detective day in, day out. I would be brought in on interrogations. I don't want to call it interrogation because that conjures up the whole idea of heavy-handed techniques. There were no heavy-handed techniques. Subject interviews, right? The way Tony Porter and Bob Vason and Willie Wade and some of these detectives that were they were just masters of their craft on how they got people to talk to them. And that sparked an interest in me to then go on and take interview and interrogation classes later on in my career and actually go out and teach interview and interrogation and be brought into cases that I wasn't even a case agent in to do subject interviews, things of that nature throughout my career.
Do you want to just kind of go through what a typical day would be like before we get into that particular day?
Yeah, sure. Mid-morning, late morning, I would roll into the FBI field office at Buzzards Point. There, you do your administrative work that you had to do. You had your squad supervisor over there. Ed Dixon was our squad supervisor. All of us would meet. You'd have to do whatever FBI paperwork. You'd talk, you'd find out what's going on. You have your squad meetings. You'd have your bureau type assignments. But we were attached to and embedded with the cold case homicide detectives. So after checking in with the field office, you would go over to MPD headquarters, which is geographically, it's on Indiana Avenue. It's like maybe walking distance to the Capitol building, Union Station, if you're familiar with Washington, D.C. It's walking distance to the mall. And over there, you had the U.S. Attorney's Office, you had the federal courthouse, you had D.C. Superior Court. That was all kind of in that same area, adjoining buildings. In D.C. Police Headquarters, let me give you the description of it because it will come important. It's one of these old granite, like probably built around the turn of the century buildings. It's now called the Hank Daly D.C. Police Headquarters building. I think it was like 6-story, 7-story building. On the top story was the police chief and the command staff. It was a multi-use building. You had probation, parole, pretrial services in there, the licensing bureau where people got their license plates. Back then, you had no metal detectors. But even this incident that we're going to get into happening there in the heart of police headquarters building, even as bad as DC was, I compare it to like lightning striking on a sunny day. Because even from where our office was, it was a pretty obscure office within that big building, that big multi-purpose building. You go into a lobby area, you come through, the first floor has all these different unrelated to policing and some police offices and things like that. But you get up on the third floor, there was main homicide. And then there's a long corridor that just kind of circles the building. And if you could think of the building as a big square and you're looking down on it, the middle of that building is empty. It's built like around a courtyard. So you get off the elevator, there's a desk sergeant, and then there's main DC homicide. And as you walk down the corridor and you get to the end of the hallway, you make a right along that corridor that circles the building. There's 7 police districts in DC, 1D, 2D, 3D, up to 7D. Each district had their own homicide unit in that corridor. Sex crimes is up there. You come around, you make another right as you get to the end of that corridor, and you come down our side, and we are like almost like a mirror image where our office is located. It's kind of empty down there. I think we were probably the only office there. And we were almost like a mirror image of like where main homicide was, but it was on the opposite side of the building, if you could picture that. So every day after the Washington field office, we would go over there. We would get to the cold case offices before our detective partners. The detectives were generally always in court during the day, in the mornings and early afternoon, and then they would come over to the office, and that's where we would go out and conduct interviews and work cases together. You'd go down to the jail sometime, you do jail interviews. You go down to Lorton Prison sometimes and do interviews of cooperators in Lorton Prison. You still worked informants and things like that. Our job mainly was get over there, get everything ready for the night lineup interviews, who would go out and see who we would look for. And then your detective would come into the office, and we would then hit the streets with the detective. So we'd go out and just do interviews, and try to put cases together the old-fashioned way, just like gumshoe detective type stuff, like what every special agent in the FBI would do. It was very interview intensive, very connecting the dots through talking to people and building that base to prove your case. Back to that day, a couple things. Let me talk about Mike Miller, devoted family man, soccer coach. He was at headquarters, came back to Washington field office, his second office agent, had 2 kids at the time, 2 small kids. One now is an FBI agent. One now is an analyst. His legacy lives on. But Mike was from the DC area. And Mike's mission was he remembered and he used to talk about what DC used to look like, what DC used to be like before this horrible crime spree had taken over the city and taken root. One thing about Mike, he was an optimist, and Mike always would remind you, no matter how bad things were, good people lived in those neighborhoods, and many of them couldn't get out of them due to poverty or despair or whatever. But this wasn't their choosing to be in an area where gangs had basically been able to take root and take hold and take control of the city. And Hank Daly, 28 years on the force at that time. Hank Daly was the detective sergeant. He was the equivalent of our FBI supervisor, but he was a DC supervisor version. And Hank was a walking encyclopedia on how to investigate a case. Hank was one of these guys you could just throw a name out at him. Oh, yeah, he was involved in this case, and he was suspected in this homicide. Just this wealth of knowledge inside his head from working homicides for so many years. Martha and I, we grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, never knew each other until we got on a squad together, until we worked together. Martha, in a word, was kind. Martha was probably one of the nicest people you would ever meet. And again, second office agent, lots of experience, tactically sound, good investigator. We all had each other's back, but you knew Martha always had your back. November 22nd, 1994. It's like any other day. It was actually a couple of days before Thanksgiving. My wife and I were going to take our daughter back to Pittsburgh for Thanksgiving. We were leaving the next day. That was our plan. I went into the cold case office. I got there as the first one there, and no one was in the office. And I went over and I sat at Lauren Ledman's desk. I started going through case files and lining up what witnesses we were trying to find that night and talk to. Like I said, it was the old style. You'd have to go through those old books, almost like phone books, to find addresses and things like that of where people lived and get phone numbers and things like that. I think we had cell phones back then, but we paid for them by ourselves. We had the old pagers for those people now that have no idea how hard it was to just navigate back in the day, but we survived. So I go over and I'm sitting at Lauren's desk, and I'm the only one in the office, and I get a phone call over the main line, and I pick up, and it's a young man's voice, and he says, "Hey, is Detective Will in?" Detective Mike Will was another cold case homicide detective. He and Lauren were in court together that afternoon. And Mike's desk was directly opposite of Lauren's desk in the main area of the cold case squad. So I said, "No, he's not here. Can I take a message?" And he says, "Can you do me a favor? Can you check? He's supposed to have a witness voucher for me." So I put the phone down. Hold on. I go over to Mike Will's desk and I see that there's a voucher, a payment voucher there. This is Mike Will's informant. Whatever name he gave me, and I didn't recall, I'm saying, "Yeah, it's here." And the kid on the phone says, "Okay, I'll be over shortly to pick it up." So that's in the back of my mind. A while later, as the afternoon's going on, Martha comes in and she is at a desk opposite in that main cold case homicide office. and we exchanged greetings and stuff, but we had just seen each other over at the Buzzards Point at the FBI field office. So she goes about doing her work, going through case files and probably doing the same thing I'm doing because she's going to go out with her detective partner that evening. And then Hank Daly, the detective sergeant, comes in and Hank comes over and starts talking to me. Hank's area was in a separate room. There was a divider between the main cold case homicide office where we all sat. It was like a bullpen, a bunch of old wooden desks like smashed together and a little walkway between them. There was makeshift rug-covered modular furniture walls that blocked off a little room next to this main cold case homicide unit. You walk through like a little makeshift kitchen that's like blocked off by little walls. And then there's a refrigerator and people kept their lunch in there and stuff like that. And then a coffee machine and sodas that people put money in a can for. When you walk through that little modular furniture kitchen thing, there was a little room area, 2 desks back there. Hank's desk was in there and Mike's desk was in there. It actually wasn't Mike's desk, but that's where Mike ended up seating. And then there was a sofa against the wall. If you're sitting on the sofa, the desk that Mike ended up sitting in is to the right, and Hank's desk is to the left. Behind that sofa is another room, and that's the interview room where we bring witnesses in, and it's recorded, and it has tape running and stuff like that. So on that day, I'm in the main cold case homicide office. Hank walks in and start talking to him, and he's like, hey, come on back to my office. And that little area beyond the modular furniture wall, was what Hank considered his office. I go back there with him and we're talking and Hank's telling war stories. Every conversation with Hank was an education, and the education on how to investigate, education on DC, and education on how it got to where it got to, education on who's who in the city, who's committing the homicides, how we got to go about proving various cases that we're working. And Hank's given this education. I'm sitting on the sofa, I have my back to the wall. Hank is at his desk, relaxed, talking. To my right, Mike Miller comes into main homicide, comes through that little modular cube area and sits at the desk opposite Hank. Mike is to my left, Hank is to my front right, and the 3 of us are talking. And to give you a perspective of how close, how tight this area is, if Hank, Mike, and I all stood up, we could touch hands in the middle. We're having a 3-way conversation. As I said, there's this like little makeshift kitchen that separates the room that you have to walk through to get out and into that main homicide room. All those, as I explained earlier, there's all the different district detective offices down the hallway. A lot of them would keep their lunches in that refrigerator there because that was the only refrigerator probably in that area, or it was convenient for them. Or they'd come in and get a cup of coffee, or they'd come in and throw some coins in the thing and get a soda out of there. As we're talking, different people are popping their head around the corner, doors opening, closing, and main homicide, people coming in, popping their head around, saying hi, whatever. And I remember at one point, Jay Abbott, Jerry Bammel, who were also on the squad, they popped in, they joined the conversation for a while, then they leave. And that's kind of how things were going. And it was a pretty relaxed thing. I was waiting for Lauren to get in. I'm talking and learning from Hank. Mike's talking and learning from Hank. We're waiting for our partners to get there so we could go out and work for the night. At that point, there were 3 individuals walk in, and one's dressed sort of like an overcoat, tie, dressed up young kid. There's 2 other younger kids with them. At that moment, they're standing in between Mike and Hank's desk, are facing each other, and I'm facing Mike and Hank's desk. My back's to the wall. And these kids are standing right in front of us. And the one kid says, hey, is Detective Will in? So my mind goes back to that phone call that I got an hour earlier from Mike Will's informant saying he was coming by to pick up this witness voucher, this informant payment. And again, it's a few days before Thanksgiving. Mike was trying to take care of this kid, say goodbye turkey for his family, kid from the streets of DC. At that moment, the other guy, the older one who is dressed more businesslike, pulls out a machine pistol. I thought it was a MAC-10 at the time, similar as a Cobra M11 machine pistol, and depresses a trigger and starts firing. Now I'm sitting on the sofa. I have my back to the wall. I always carried my firearm on my right, on my hip. It wasn't a fanny pack, wasn't an ankle holster or anything like that. I had on my hip because, again, you want to be ready in DC at any time when you're out on the street, but you'd never expect something like that happening there. First thing that happens in my mind, I guess the nuns got to me early. I grew up Catholic. I'm consider myself a Christian. I started saying Hail Marys and I started saying Glory Bees. Bullets are flying out at the end of his barrel. I'm sitting on the sofa. I pull my firearm out, take aim and start shooting at him. And then I start to get up from the sofa. And at this point, he had spun like a 360. He hits Hank first. Hank goes to the floor, multiple shots into Hank. This gun's fully automatic. It's an illegally owned handgun. It's illegally remanufactured machine pistol. It's a machine gun, basically. You press the trigger and bullets are flying out. What comes to mind to me is as fast as I'm pulling my trigger, I can't pull that trigger fast enough to get the bullets out fast enough because these bullets are just whizzing. He does his 360. He hits Hank. He hits one of the informants in the rear. I didn't see what happened to the other informant, but he would have ran past me and hid into that interview room that was directly behind me underneath the desk. He shoots Mike. I don't see Mike. Mike drops down behind his desk on the floor, between the floor and the wall. And now I'm up on my feet. I'm firing at him. He's firing at me. And we're like feet apart. And I'm getting hit. I'm getting hit in the upper chest. I could feel it. Initially, the bullets were burning, but it wasn't like they hurt. It was the acrid, pungent smell of, I guess, gunpowder, like you're at the range. Your ears are ringing. Everything was going super fast. And it only lasted seconds from what they say. The final forensic bureau report, that shootout in my room, in my area, even though it was going full speed, like a million miles an hour. Part of my mind can break this down almost like an old movie reel, like slide by slide by slide of what's taking place. As I'm getting hit, I get hit in the arm, right arm. I get hit in the upper chest. My left arm, I had a Timex watch, one of those Timex Ironman watches. That's what saved my wrist. It ricocheted the bullet amazingly. I still have that bezel from it. The doctor said, it's like you could lay a pencil through my bone, the way the bullet went. That watch stopped the bullet from going through my arm, which probably would have caused me to bleed out. I'm backing up and I'm firing at him and he's firing at me as I'm backing up. And then I felt one of the bullets hit my chest and I knew that was serious. It was almost like immediately like a balloon burst inside of me. And it was like, you could just feel just kind of everything inside of you just kind of like falling down. I knew that was serious. And that's the one that did the most damage. It hit my heart. It went through the pericardial sac. But for the grace of God, I'm here because it went through my low pressure chamber of my heart. It then penetrated my lung, took out part of my liver. Well, it went through my liver, but that regenerates, that grows back. It took out part of my kidney, and that bullet's still actually in my back. They said, leave it in there. They weren't going to operate and take it out. As I'm backing up, I'm shooting my firearm, pulling that trigger as fast as I can. And these bullets are whizzing at me. And I'm concerned because I know Mike is behind at that desk. And my big concern is like crossfire. And I don't want to hit Mike. I'm just firing at this guy. And then I knew in my head when that one that I could feel, I knew was serious, hit me. I said, I got to get down. I got to get down on the ground. At that moment, the bullets hit my femur, my upper leg. That was when I felt excruciating pain. When you look at x-rays after the surgery, it's almost like somebody took a bite out of an apple. My femur was shattered. It took down my leg and I immediately dropped. So now I'm laying out on the floor. I can't see where the shooter's at. I'm below the armrest. So if I'm sitting on a sofa, the right armrest. Now I got up from the sofa, I'm firing at him, I'm going backwards. I get hit in the leg and I fall to the ground. It takes my leg out from under me and I fall to the ground. And now I'm looking at, I can't raise up over the armrest. All I do is I put my arm up over the armrest. I continue to fire downrange from where he last was. And then I go in and out of consciousness. I come to, the first thing I can hear gunfire, not in my immediate area. And that would have been when he was in the shootout in the adjacent room beyond those makeshift walls, those modular furniture walls. He would have been in the shootout with Martha at that point. I didn't know that. All I knew is I looked at my firearm, what they issued us back in, the SIG 226 9mm, and I knew I hadn't fired the lockback. I knew I still had it. I didn't know how many bullets I fired. I knew I didn't fire to lockback. So I'm thinking, oh my God, he's coming back to finish us off when I hear the gunfire. I'm trying to stay awake. I'm saying Hail Marys. I'm saying Glory Bees. I'm praying. And then your ears are ringing and I'm just waiting for him to come back. And I know I still have a few bullets left. I think the Bureau said the final report said I fired 12 rounds. And then the shooting stops. And again, I'm in and out of consciousness. The next thing I recall is behind Hank to my right, and I see Hank laying on the ground and he's not conscious and he looks like he's in really bad shape. I won't describe it, but I see Hank on the floor and there's a door a few feet behind where Hank's desk was. It goes out to the main hallway. That door always remained locked. The main entrance into the cold case squad was that adjacent main room from us where Martha was sitting and where Martha got in the gunfight. I can hear this click, 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 click. It had like a slide bullet over it, like this big, heavy 1920s or whenever that building was built. Back before air conditioning, they had like a metal grate in the bottom, like this heavy, thick steel grate that airflow would come through. I could see the doorknob going back and forth, click, 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 click. And I could hear a woman's voice on the other side saying, "We can't get the door open." I yell out, "Officer needs assistance." 3 of us are down. I didn't know what was going on in the other room, but I yelled out our names, going back and forth. When I heard "we can't get in the room," my mind went back to an incident that happened a few weeks before. And I'll digress here for a moment. A few weeks before, there's a cipher lock that was on that door into the cold case squad. This may have been a week before. I was out with Lauren, my detective partner. It's a Friday night. We go out, we do interviews. He drops me off to my Buick car. I left some stuff up in the cold case office. I go up, retrieve my stuff before I come back down and go home. When I get up to the cold case office, I press in the numbers on the old cipher lock and I can't get in. I guess they changed the combination, didn't tell anybody. So I go down to main homicide, desk sergeant. He doesn't know what they changed it to. I go down to the different districts. They don't know. Get on my cell phone and I start calling. It's a Friday night. It's late. I start calling different people on the squad. I go down the list. Nobody has a combination. I call everybody on the squad. Ed Dixon, Jerry Bammel, blah, blah, blah. Nobody's answering. I finally get to Sue Kostler, who was also an agent on the squad. I'm like, "Sue, do you know the cipher lock? I'm locked out of the cold case office. I'm trying to get in." And she gave me whatever the number was and I got in. It took me 45 minutes that Friday night to be able to get into that office a couple of weeks before this happened. So I'm laying there and I know that I'm seriously, critically wounded on the floor. And I hear the woman detective's voice on the other side saying, "We can't get in. We don't have the combination." And it took me 45 minutes to get in a week earlier. I made a decision. I was not going to die there. So although that door was always propped open, we'll never know. But I believe when Mike Will's informants and the shooter came in behind them, I believe he closed the door behind them and it locked. Therefore, if they didn't have that combination lock, no one was getting in there. Now I'm laying on the floor. I know I'm hit seriously. And I hear this woman's voice on the other end of the door saying, "We can't get in. We don't have the combination." My mind goes back to that. And I thought to myself, I'm not dying in here. And I got a wife and an 8-month-old daughter at home. I'm not dying here. So I'm in excruciating pain for my leg. I crawl over to that door. Every bit of strength I had, I tried to get up and take my body weight and slide the slide bolt before I turn the knob, and then I fall back. I can't do it. A second time, I get up. I don't get up. I mean, I'm like on the floor kind of, but I reach up and all my body weight at that point, all my strength, I slide that slide bolt and I turn the knob and boom, the door blows open. The shooting has stopped. The shooter had killed himself at that point. However, the detectives, without ballistic vests or without any knowledge of what's going on inside, all they heard was a lot of gunfire and shooting going on, and they had no idea what was on the other side of that. But you had Neil Trugman, Brian Cowan, and Kaufman were 3 DC detectives, and you talk about absolute heroism in my book. They weren't waiting for a SWAT team to come in. They weren't waiting for any order to be given. When that door blew open, they rushed in. They pulled me and Hank out. They couldn't see Mike, unfortunately, because Mike had slumped behind the desk and he couldn't be seen. And you couldn't see Martha on the other side of that wall. Next thing I know, I'm being dragged down the hallway on my back, and I never stopped praying. At the time, I was practicing Catholic, but I said, "Call priest, I'm a Catholic." And then I am being pulled down the hallway and I get taken into a room. I'm in the room. I believe it was paramedics or EMTs or someone was working on me, but they tore off my shirt, my jacket. They put like cellophane over my chest wounds. And I knew, oh no, that's sunken chest wound is what I was experiencing. I really was having trouble breathing and I really, really, really wanted to fall asleep. I mean, I was doing everything I could to fight falling asleep because I knew if I fell asleep, it was over. I would die. And I knew instinctively, innately, you just know that these were really serious wounds. But three things I also knew. I knew if I continued to pray, if I didn't fall asleep, and if they got me to a hospital, I was going to live. There was a lot of activity, people around me. I recall Lieutenant Musgrove, who was like Hank Daly's supervisor. He's on the MPD radio. He's calling out stuff. He gives a few words to me like, hey, it's going to be all right, John. You're going to be okay. There's just a lot of activity going on. And it just seemed like it was taking so long for them to get me out of there. My father died before I ever got in the FBI. And I mean, it sounds crazy to many, but my dad was a corpsman in the Navy. He worked X-ray technician his whole life at Mercy Hospital in Pittsburgh, PA. He was a corpsman in the South Pacific on the landings on a LST when the Marines were taking the island hopping campaign. I remember I heard my father's voice. I heard him yell, "You got to get him out of here now." As crazy as that sounds. And like at that moment, somebody just took action and they put me on like a sheet, rolled me on a sheet, multiple people on each side of the sheet, picked me up, and they started running me down this back hallway to a back elevator. And right as those elevator doors opened, there was a waiting cot with paramedics there. They put me on the cot. They take me down to, I remember coming out the Indiana Avenue side of the building, and there was a waiting ambulance transport. I remember getting they put me in the ambulance and there was another detective sergeant in there. He's talking to me the whole time. He was just talking to me, keeping me awake. And it was almost like those old like Western movies you see I used to watch as a kid and stuff where they like, stay awake. The guy's shot and they slap his face and they tell him, try to keep him awake. I just knew. I never stopped praying. I knew I had to stay awake, and I knew they'd get me to the hospital. They took me all the way up to Washington Hospital Center, which was up on North Capitol Street, which is a pretty good drive from there. Through traffic, DC traffic, middle of the afternoon, rush hour is probably starting to come on at that point, and helicopters in the air. It was fortuitous that they took me there because, and this is a sad statement of Washington, D.C. at that time, but there was no wars. There's no Afghanistan. There was no Iraq. There was no wars going on at that time. And we had years of peace, right? I think the last was Vietnam up until then. The murder rates in inner cities of America and major cities of America were so bad, but DC being the worst, they supplanted Gary, Indiana per capita, Detroit for per capita homicide rates years in a row, every year running. The doctors from the Walter Reed Medical Center, your Army doctors and your Navy doctors from the Bethesda Naval Center, they would work the emergency rooms of DC General and George Washington Hospital and Washington Hospital Center in order to get combat field practice on how to deal with gunshot wounds in the event that the U.S. would ever go to war and they would have to work on U.S. soldiers. So it was a benefit that I got up there, and it was the Bethesda Naval team, I believe, was on that day. And they were the ones that brought me in and were working on me. And also Dr. Bikram Paul. Dr. Paul, he's a surgeon. He's since retired, I believe, from the medical practice. But Dr. Paul was the doctor. Bill Clinton was the president at the time. And Dr. Paul was the doctor selected to operate on the president in the event that in a contingency plan, if there was ever an assassination attempt against Bill Clinton. So I was through God's grace, I was in the best hands that you could have in the medical field. I remember when they got me to the operating room, they're working on me, and I just felt like I was drowning. There was that what actually hit my heart. And I was really trying to stay awake. And I remember Detective Middleton was up there, who I'd previously, just a week or so before, been out on an interview with and on that one case. And he gave me a thumbs up. You're going to be okay. And he's on the radio and all kind of activity going on and people running around. And I just felt like it's closing in on me and I'm really having trouble breathing. They came and they stuck a tube down my throat. I felt like I had instant relief. I was like, it's like almost like something drained and I could breathe. And I was freezing cold. I was shivering, probably because there's so much blood loss. A lot of people don't. My wife donated blood. She's the universal donor. So I have my wife's blood in me. I was shivering, and I remember they put like these hot towels, these hot, wet towels over me. Felt some relief. And then they started wheeling me out of the emergency room into I guess what was the operating room. And they put this big mask, started coming down over my face. And I stopped them. And I said at that moment, I said, is it okay for me to fall asleep? And they said, yeah, you can fall asleep right then. So they put this mask over and I was out. I know in talking to the doctors afterwards, they have to cut you from your neckline all the way down to below your belly button, open you up, fishing around for bullets. At one point, they tell me, I didn't know this, but they tell me my heart stopped. Dr. Paul actually had my heart in his hands outside of my chest cavity, and he was massaging it to get it to beat and keep it alive. And they say I was out. But after the operation, I remember distinctly, it was like a shadow to me. But it's like I remember the faces. When they wheeled me out of the operating room, all my squad mates, everybody was like lined up on both sides of the walls. They wheeled me out. And I remember Jimmy Cottle. I was on the drug squad with him prior to C-21, prior to the cold case squad. Jimmy Cottle got down on my face and it's okay, Johnny, jump out of her. I even asked him after. I'm like, did you say that? He's like, yeah, I know it happened, but they say, you were out. There's no way. I came to in the operating room. My wife was there. It was the first person I saw. I was in the hospital from November 22nd through Thanksgiving. We never made it to Pittsburgh that year. I was in intensive care. And then I was finally released December 22nd, and that was right before Christmas. While I was in the hospital, I think the person that was affected most by the shooting was my wife. Look, I was heavily sedated. I was in a hospital bed, but she was the one who was dealing with all the stress, the strain, fielding all the calls and having to worry about our 8-month-old daughter, keeping things as normal as could be during that traumatic time period. She went to the funeral services for Martha, Mike, and Hank that were in DC. She's the one that dealt with the firsthand, the pain, the loss, the stress, and everything that went along with that. She nursed me back to health after I was out of the hospital. And through all these years, she's been the one who was a pillar of strength that really, if I could say if there's any one single person in this whole world that, helped me and helped our family and really got us through all this, it would be my wife, Helena. We call her Lenny. The FBI had agents posted at my house around the clock. They didn't know if this was a larger conspiracy. They didn't know what was going on, really. And they didn't know if we were specifically targeted. And I'll get into that later, a postscript, so to speak, about what really happened and why. But they didn't know. My wife was working when I got shot. I know Special Agent Beth Babiak. She goes to her law firm, got her, broke the news to her, and took her up to Washington Hospital Center. They always had people with the family. Agents round the clock protecting my family because I wasn't there. They would come in, they would sleep there. They became part of the family. They got my daughter to sleep when she was fussy. I wasn't there. I was in the hospital, but this is all related to me by my wife, and eternal appreciation for all those that sacrificed their time and did that. And then even I was in a wheelchair for quite a while afterwards. And I know guys from different squads, they came and they built like a ramp so that I could get the wheelchair up into the house. I got back to work April 3rd, I believe, of that year. I was on limited duty because I'm a lawyer, member of the bar. They had me on the legal squad. And then there was another agent that had become, I think that's the second one to ever be a special assistant U.S. attorney from the FBI. And I actually, starting in May of 95, I got assigned permanently while I was on limited duty. I underwent several operations after that on my leg, different things, but they assigned me over to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Virginia. So I was a prosecutor with a badge and a gun. I was trying FBI cases, and guys that I worked with and women I worked with over there, I was getting search warrants approved for them. And I had I had 5 felony trials and a bunch of plea agreements. It was quite a charge. And I spent until 96. I was over there, and then I got a transfer, Louis Free. I couldn't go back to cold weather at the time because of arthritis and healing and stuff like that. So Free basically gave me my choice of where to go, and we picked Tampa Division, and We raised our family down in the Fort Myers RA out of Tampa division until London. And I came back as the SSRA for Fort Myers and then retired back in 2018.
Was there ever a thought in your mind just to stay at the U.S. Attorney's Office and not return as an investigator, as an agent?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it went through my mind. Looking back, I'm glad I came back to the Bureau, and it was what I always wanted to do. Growing up, I always wanted to be a police officer, become an FBI agent. That was a lifelong goal. When I got to the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was a very, very rewarding experience. I mean, to stand at the bar and address a judge, John Kuchta, on behalf of the United States, Your Honor, to make charging decisions and to work with agents. It's like working at a totally different level. You're standing and making arguments, trying to convince a jury of the person's guilt and going into the grand jury and presenting cases. It was the rocket docket over there in the Eastern District of Virginia. It still is. And I think they have a little statue over the door, the tortoise and the hare. Their saying is, justice delayed is justice denied. The Speedy Trial Act is invoked in every case. It's very limited when they will actually grant continuances. And if you indict a case, you are going to trial or it gets resolved by a plea agreement. And I mean, you have to be ready. It was a baptism by fire. It was probably one of the coolest experiences I had in my FBI career. It was a great time. I can't deny it. I could have stayed on. I look back. Overall, I'm glad I went back to the Bureau because that's what I always wanted to do. As great as that was being a prosecutor representing the United States of America and pushing Bureau cases forward and DEA cases, back then it was Customs, now it's HSI, but I worked everything. State cases, National Park Service cases, crime on government reservations, Lorton cases. It was quite a time. It was quite a charge. And then to be carrying forward as a prosecutor cases of agents that you worked with on various squads was really a very rewarding experience. Little postscript. Let me go back to the reasons for the shooting. The shooter grew up suburban Maryland, two-parent family, parents divorced. If you look at his writings and stuff, he's a really talented person, but very dark. I guess went to evil versus goodness in looking at prior FOIA information, stuff like that. A statement of his mother. She was a Christian. She tried to convince him when he came of age not to go back. He went back down to DC and got running around with a gang, and she tried to talk to him. And I guess there was no reasoning with him. Whatever the allure of evil, money, drugs, fast times, whatever, but he was drawn to it. And that's the choice he made. He was running with a gang called the First and Kennedy Crew. And back in DC, it wasn't Crips and Bloods or anything that organized. You had localized street gangs that basically controlled the drug turf, the crack trade in their little area. They were usually named after the cross streets, First Street and Kennedy Street in Northeast DC. He went to jail. The police raided one night their gang hideout and they seized weapons and drugs and all kinds of stuff. And they were getting ready, actually, believed to take part in shootings against a rival gang. These guys all these gangs, they would just, somebody's encroaching in their turf, they'd get running gun battles in the streets. And the First and Kennedy Crew was also responsible, just to show you the level of violence. There was a woman who put her kid in the car. She lived up in that North Capitol Street area, was coming after work, picked her kid up from daycare, was driving down North Capitol Street, got stuck at a red light. There's a running gun battle. Her kid's in the back seat in the car seat. Bang, bullet goes slamming through the side window of her car and goes through her head. And based on a running gun battle between the First and Kennedy Street Crew and a rival gang that was fighting over control of drug turf. And I mean, that's pretty much how it was in DC. Anyone at any time. I mean, it was a high crime area, but it's like the lawlessness had completely taken over, disorder, and the level of violence and depravity that took place there, the stuff that you would see when you go into these apartments and just how kids were taken care of. It was an eye-opener. I grew up in a city. I went to a city neighborhood. I thought I was a pretty tough kid, but it wasn't anything like what you saw in those days in DC, what you were exposed to. So First and Kennedy Street Crew, that MPD does a raid a couple years before on them. They lock up the shooter and he gets convicted and does 2 years in Lorton. He gets early release, parole, and is released back on the streets in October of 94. And of course, his family was his gang. So he starts running back I think he got released in the fall. Might not have been, maybe the summer or the fall. He starts running with the gang again, First and Kennedy Street crew, and they mark a rival drug dealer who is breaking the rules of the drug trade back then because he's flashing a lot of cash. He's driving a nice car, he's wearing nice clothing. And this drug dealer is laying his head down where his girlfriend's living. Girlfriend is the granddaughter of the owner of the home. He's a retired postal worker, 80-some-year-old man, described to be salt of the earth individual who lives in a room upstairs. But granddaughter is letting drug dealers stay with her in grandpa's home. Her mom and other friends are staying there. They identify this drug dealer dating this girl as a mark. And so First and Kennedy Street guys, the shooter and a couple others, I intentionally don't give their names. I just see no reason to give them credit. And that's why I'm calling them shooter, if anybody's wondering. So Kennedy Street crew members, 3 of them, the shooter and 2 others, the leader and another, they decide they're going to do a home invasion. They start watching this drug dealer and they feel he's holding money and drugs, and they're going to do a home invasion when the opportunity happens. So they see him go over to the girlfriend's over at grandpa's place, which is the home where the girlfriend's staying. They burst their way into the home. This is early October. They put everybody down on the floor. Grandpa's upstairs. Here's the commotion. And then they beat him unmercilessly, trying to find out where's your drugs, where's your stash, where's your money. He doesn't have anything, doesn't give anything up. Put everybody down on the floor, bang, 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 bang. The mom of the girlfriend plays dead. They shoot a drug dealer, kill him, kill the girlfriend. They run out the back door of the home. As they're running out the back door, Grandpa is coming down the steps and they unload into him. He's coming down just to see what's going on, and they kill him. So there's a triple homicide. As they leave the residence, the shooter, in our case, in this matter, he vomits. DNA was in its infancy. Probably back then, it was like a big deal to get DNA evidence. They weren't doing it. Probably take about 6 months to get back from the lab back then, or maybe even longer. So he runs out the back door. Later on that evening, they get stopped, field inquiry by the DC police. So they know that they were in that area. And then detectives start working this triple homicide. And they pretty early on make the connection that it's the First and Kennedy Street crew members, and that the shooter is out on probation, I guess, early release. He has the most to lose. So DC detectives investigating this triple homicide wasn't us, wasn't anybody in the cold case squad. It was main homicide on the other side of the building, on the other side of the 3rd floor from us down the corridor. They start investigating this triple homicide. They bring in the shooter multiple times. Even his father brings him down at some point for an interview, and they interview him, and he never gives up. He's not a snitch. He doesn't give up his involvement, and they interview him, subject interviews, and he stays down there. I think one interview went like 4 or 6 hours or something like that. But every time he goes back after being interviewed by DC Homicide, his gang members start accusing him of being a snitch. Hey, you're down there talking to Homicide. You're down there a long time. You must be saying something to him. You got no heart. You threw up after the scene. You know, you're an expletive, derogatory terms. You know, you're snitching on us. Based on writings that came out after subsequent search warrants and stuff like this, very dark individual. His aim was to kill police officers and prove to his family, the gang, that he was not a snitch. And the way he was going to prove that is he was going to go down to DC police headquarters and exact revenge on the detectives who were investigating him. Not us, didn't even know about us. We weren't in any way involved, but he was going down to that main homicide office on the other side of the building, on the other side of the 3rd floor from us, to exact revenge. And he picked November 22nd, 1994. Why November 22nd? November 22nd was the anniversary of the John F. Kennedy assassination. He's from the First and Kennedy Street crew. Based on writings, his dream, I have a dream, you know, Martin Luther King's dream was for goodness and peace and break down barriers. His dream was the opposite. His dream was November 22nd would be a day in America that gangs would rise up throughout the nation and kill police officers. Very distorted. He was on the side of evil, darkness, whatever you want to say. His soul wasn't saved, although I think his mother probably tried. So what he did is he dressed up like a detective and had his illegally possessed and illegally remanufactured firearm, the fire fully automatic, and he came down to DC Police Headquarters. Back then, no one stopped you. There was no metal detectors. There was nothing. It's not like today. Actually, this incident is why we have that security we have now, but back then you didn't, surprisingly. He walked into DC Police Headquarters, got on the elevator to go up the third floor to go to main homicide. Just so happens he gets on the elevator at the exact same time that Mike Will's informants are getting on the elevator. They don't know each other. Mike Will's informants are coming up to our office to get that witness voucher so they can buy a turkey for Thanksgiving. He gets up on the elevator, doors open on the third floor, and he follows them out. He asks the two informants, "Hey, where's homicide?" And they say, "Oh, follow us. We're going to homicide." Because these kids, their background, young kids from the street, I mean, they know the difference. All they knew as homicide was Mike Will and where Mike Will worked. And he worked in this office around the hall on the other side of the building from where they're getting off the elevator. So he follows them. He actually stops at DC homicide, main homicide. And he stops them. He says, "Hey, isn't this homicide?" And they're like, "No, man, we're going to homicide." It continues, and as bad as this incident is, if he would have walked into main homicide at that time, there was a press conference, there was some big arrest going on, there was news reporters, there was cameras, there was a bunch of detectives, there was the command staff of the Metropolitan Police. We're in main homicide at that moment. If he would have walked in where he was actually intending on going at that time and opened fire with 39 rounds in a fully automatic weapon, the damage would have been a lot greater. Instead, he walks down the hallway, continues on with them. There's some dispute that they see the firearm or not on statements, but bottom line, he goes in and that cipher lock on a cold case squad door would lock. It's an old door and you really have to pull it shut. They would keep it jammed open because people would go in and get their lunches or they'd go in and get coffee in that little makeshift kitchen area between the main cold case homicide office and that sitting area where Hank sat and where we were sitting. So he comes into the main cold case homicide office and passes Martha. They hear our voices, I guess, in the back. And they go into this little section. And that's when the kid says, "Is Mike Will in?" And then, the rest of the story. The Bureau turned over every single stone in that investigation. They went to the ends of the earth, literally, to bring to justice everybody that was involved in that case. From the person that remanufactured, made that Cobra M11 fully automatic, the gun dealer on that, the people involved in that, and just locked up, eventually built enterprise cases on everybody in the First and Kennedy. The main leader of the First and Kennedy crew was a fugitive. I believe he ended up in Tanzania. They identified him, located him using the LEGAT, and they went out there and worked with the police out there. And Mark Giuliano and Anthony Brigadini, MPD Detective Tony Brigadini, ended up arresting him and brought him back to justice. That was a time of really living dangerously. It was a city under siege. Shortly after that, there was a subject going around and assassinating police officers. There was a PG County police officer in his vehicle working an off-duty up in Prince George's County, just over the district line, who got killed in his vehicle. There was a police officer went to Wendy's to get a cup of coffee, was shot. No one knew if this was like a larger conspiracy or larger plan to go after police. 6 months later in May, after this incident, Special Agent Bill Christian, who was on the SOG squad, SWAT member, they were on stakeout surveillance on the final arrest of the subject in those cases. And Billy Christian was killed. Bammel was involved in the shootout. Jerry Bammel, who's squad mate. The shooter in that case was responsible for the slaying of PG County officer John Novobilski. And the shooter in that case took Novobilski's service weapon from him after he assassinated him. When the police were closing in on him, Jerry Bammel, who was also on our squad, who, if I go back to our shooting, was just in the room right prior to the shooting happening. There was a protracted shootout as well as other members, and Jerry shot him multiple times. But the shooter in that case killed himself after he was, grievously wounded by, the shootout that he was in with the FBI and with Jerry Bammel. He was grievously wounded, but he shot himself with Novobilski's gun, service weapon that he took. Even though there were two unrelated crimes, it's similar to the shooter in our case killing himself with Martha's gun and ending his life, the same way. And I always look at that dark time in our nation's capital as like a continuum, right? That continuum of violence between November 22nd, 1994 and May of 1995 really galvanized the city to turn things around and cooperate and get behind police and really make DC what it is today. But unfortunately, I think we're kind of slipping back there because people don't remember recent history.
When you go out and talk to police departments and law enforcement sessions, what are the lessons learned from this?
I believe a legacy of some of the lessons learned for law enforcement and the FBI in general is after November 22nd, 1994, the FBI radically changed the firearms training program based on what happened in that shooting. And just as they moved from revolvers, 6-shot revolvers after the Miami shooting to issuing pistols with 15-round magazines, they really changed how we train and how we qualify. And we know police agencies throughout the country base their program in part or in whole off the FBI's qualification course. And if you look at all the shots fired between me and Martha, right? None of those shots hit center mass. They were all non-fatal, mainly in the hip and groin area of the shooter. And, I was alive as a sole survivor, right? To testify to the firearms training unit and others that studied this and developed policies and procedures and programs afterwards, that I developed tunnel vision. I focused on the shooter's gun. He was holding his gun in his right hand. And if you look at where the shots where he was hit, it was in that hip groin area where he would have been holding his gun. And I can't say for Martha, but all the shots that she got off were again focused in that area. And forensically, I think you could say that the shooter probably, although he had a fully automatic machine gun, right, and he just sprayed, but like the first shot that hit me went through my bicep and my right bicep, and I'm a right-handed shooter, so I'm holding my gun. Did he have that same focus? And then some of the shots that hit Martha were in her right arm, her shooting hand, her, the bullet that disabled the magazine in the shooter's gun, it hit the bottom of the magazine. Again, focus on the gun. And if you look back, I'm sure you remember when we went through, firearms training and stuff, they'd start you back at like the 15-yard line, and then you move up to the 10. And then I think you finish back then at like the 5-yard line. Most of our time was spent at a target 30 to 45 feet away. And that's just not where gunfights happen, right? Gunfights are close in. It's close in combat. So from that, the firearms training for the FBI now starts close in. You're right, the target, they've done a lot more on focusing on center mass with not just the Q target, but, going for circles and center mass and get as many rounds at that shooter at close in. Firearms qualification was radically changed after this incident. And the fact that many police agencies follow the FBI model on firearms training, I would have to say, and I have no way of quantifying this in numbers, but I would think that change has probably saved a lot of police officers' lives.
Yeah, I can imagine so.
The FBI, they study, they overstudy, they do analysis. They went back and looked at a lot of these spacing of where shootings occur, and they completely developed the firearms training and the pistol qualification course based on, the fact that you are most likely to get in a close-in combat situation, a close-in shooting, and train to that. The highest honor I had came after my FBI career. I was retired at that point, and Mike Miller's son, I remember Mike calling him Mickey at the time, but he goes by Mike. I remember Mike was a soccer coach and always had soccer team pictures of the different kids, the teams he was coaching on his desk, and had his kids' pictures up there when they're small. His daughter's an analyst. His son is a special agent. After I retired, for a few moments, I get to stand in his shoes. A few brief moments on the FBI Quantico Academy stage and present Mike Miller's son with his credentials and stand in the place of his dad and hand him his badge and his credentials. And that was probably, it came post-bureau, but that was probably the highest honor that I could ever have, to be asked to do that.
He asked you to do that?
Yes.
That must have been just a wonderful feeling that he would ask you to do something that normally a father would do for a son or another relative would do for a relative coming into the FBI family. I could understand how that meant so much to you.
The legacy Mike sacrifices, Martha sacrifices, Hank sacrifices. Every time a DC detective or police officer walks through the doors of MPD headquarters, they know who that's named after. They know why it's named after him. They know what that sacrifice means. And it's probably also a constant reminder, just like it is to every FBI agent that walks into the Pittsburgh field office and knows Martha's sacrifices and knows what that means. That presence, how many lives has that saved over the years? How many people out on some high-risk arrest in the Pittsburgh division maybe thought twice about, do I go in here alone or do I wait for backup? Do I go around this corner? Because they've been brought up and they're constantly reminded with that sacrifice. Again, their legacy, their sacrifice lives on and is a constant reminder to everyone serving of that.
For this incident, you are the recipient of the FBI's Medal of Valor, the FBI's highest honor.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, I gladly give them all back, if you could change things. But I think in the course of protecting freedom and the liberties that we hold dear, there are things worth fighting for and there's things worth dying for.
I do want to ask about you. What about physically? How are you doing?
All the way up until the end of my career, I always took the fit test, always successfully completed the fit test. Aches, pains, arthritis. I mean, I've been through a series of surgeries related to mostly my leg. I could bore you with details about bone grafts and rods removed and pins taken out and different stuff like that. But I mean, all in all, I feel pretty blessed. I was told that I would never walk again. And then I was certainly in a wheelchair and in crutches and then on a cane and then, running again. So, physically, yeah, I'm getting older. I got lots of aches and pains and you feel it a lot more and body aches. Definitely feel the weather. I'm a weather vane. I could tell you if a front's coming through, yeah, I feel that. But other than that, life's good.
You mentioned that there is at least one bullet that they didn't take out. Does that bother you?
I really never feel it. No, there's one still resting in probably like my torso. One bullet did most of the damage, although, I got hit twice in the chest and the one really turned south and took out a bunch of the organs. That's still there. And then I still have shrapnel in my leg. I mean, I think if anything, my leg is probably what has caused the most problem. My gait was always off after that. And I've had multiple surgeries since then to correct it. That's really, I'm still here, I look at life as every day is a day of Thanksgiving. We've been blessed. We got 3 wonderful kids, a great son-in-law. I've been able to share that life that I wouldn't have otherwise had. Every step of the way through my career, my wife was there supporting me and behind me and backing me. In those days when we were hanging on to my life, she's always been my biggest cheerleader. She'd be out there in the car when I was training to get into the FBI Academy and running. And I remember her following me in the car and screaming out the window when I was running through North Park in Pennsylvania, where they used to do the FBI entry test for recruits. I'm thankful every day you push on. You recognize the sacrifices. You appreciate the sacrifices and that you're here. I'm nothing but thankful to my Lord and Savior.
Thank you so much for reviewing this case and allowing me to share your story. Before we go, I have some standard questions that I ask. The first one is why and when you joined the FBI.
It was April 21st, 1991. I was NAC 9111. It was a lifelong dream. I tried to attain the highest level of education I was capable of. My father never finished high school. He got a GED. My sister and I were the first generation in our family to go to college. I eked it out and worked full time and went to law school at night at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. And I really did that because I wanted to be an FBI agent. I grew up watching cop shows and too many cop shows, I guess. The sure way into the FBI back then was you either had to be an accountant or a lawyer. And I couldn't do math. I wasn't going to be an accountant. I've always been interested in political science. That was my major in law, and law to me was always fascinating in the legal system. And I ended up going to law school for the purpose of joining the FBI.
When did you retire and what are you doing now?
I retired August 21, 2018. That was 27 years to the day of when I graduated from the FBI Academy. Currently, I'm Chief Security Officer at an aerospace company on the Space Coast of Florida. After retirement, I went into ethics and compliance, corporate investigations, and currently I'm Chief Security Officer for a really great aerospace company that makes really cool airplanes.
I always like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
So, Jerry, as you know, I spent the last 5 years of my FBI career assigned to the legal attaché office at the U.S. Embassy in London, England. So I think it's fitting that I end with a quote by Sir Winston Churchill. Churchill said, "No one pretends democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms of government that have been tried from time to time." Now, America, our government, our Constitution, which you and I took an oath to uphold and defend so many years ago, provides the greatest system for protecting civil rights, individual freedom, and liberty in world history. Albeit, our system is imperfect. I think there's dangerous and false narratives that have taken root in this country. And this false narrative is perpetrated by the people who call to defund the police. And this only serves to further divide and destabilize a nation. Is there really any wonder that lawlessness, civil disorder, violent crime, murder rates are skyrocketing in cities and towns that vilify law enforcement? I'm not saying that all law enforcement is perfect. By no means. We know that they aren't. But the majority, the vast majority of law enforcement day in, day out, make sacrifices. Their families make sacrifices to keep us safe. And I think the decline in support for law enforcement among our government officials and in popular culture has had serious ramifications nationwide. The FBI reports a 50% rise in law enforcement officers assaulted and killed in the line of duty between last year and this year. Police recruiting is woefully low nationwide, and police officers are retiring or leaving law enforcement in droves. Now, we must not forget that there's a very thin blue line that separates anarchy from ordered liberty. The last time this country danced with this soft on crime devil was in the 1970s and peaked in the early 1990s when our major cities were reduced to crime-infested hellholes. My message is to the members of this younger generation who've grown up in relative peace, stability, and prosperity, and who never learned the lessons of the recent past. And my message is also to the members of my generation and older generations who forgot the lessons of the recent past. So as you sit in outdoor cafes, sipping lattes in neighborhoods that were once crime-ridden killing fields, recognize that the air of freedom that you breathe today is not free. The comfort and security you enjoy was paid for with the blood, sacrifice, and lives of this generation and previous generations of women and men of law enforcement. Names like Michael John Miller, Henry Joseph Daly, Martha Dixon, William Christian, and the over 22,000 officer names carved into the granite walls of the Law Enforcement Memorial in Washington, D.C.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of John Kuchta, a longer bio for him, other images, and links to articles and videos about the tragic November 22nd, 1994 shooting incident. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, You get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.